Wyoming Territory, 1878. The land was as unforgiving as it was beautiful, rolling prairie grass stretching toward distant mountains, where the promise of gold and the threat of death dwelled in equal measure. In this harsh country, 24-year-old Wyatt Morgan had learned one truth above all others: a man rides alone if he wants to survive. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cottonwood Springs as Wyatt dismounted his chestnut gelding. His lean frame carried the weariness of 3 months on the trail, driving cattle from Texas to Wyoming. His handsome face, bronzed by the relentless sun, remained impassive despite his exhaustion. Only the slight tightening around his blue eyes betrayed any emotion as he surveyed the town that would be his temporary home. "Come on, Shadow," he murmured, leading his horse toward the livery. The animal had been his only companion for longer than he cared to remember. Wyatt believed deeply that attachments were dangerous in a land where most men died young and violently. His father had died with a Comanche arrow in his chest when Wyatt was just 14. His mother had followed 6 months later, heartbreak doing what illness couldn't. Since then, Wyatt had kept to himself, taking jobs that required little conversation and allowed him to move on whenever the walls of civilization started closing in. "A man's best friend is his horse and his rifle," he often told himself. "Everything else is just asking for trouble." The livery stable smelled of hay and horse sweat, familiar comforts to a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. After arranging proper care for Shadow, Wyatt headed toward the boarding house. A hot bath, a decent meal, and a real bed were all he wanted tonight. Tomorrow he'd collect his pay from the cattle drive and figure out his next move. What he did not want, what he had never wanted, was to round the corner and collide directly with a young woman carrying a stack of books. The impact sent her books flying, and only Wyatt's quick reflexes prevented her from falling. His hands caught her shoulders as she stumbled, and for a moment they stood frozen, staring at each other in surprise. "I apologize, miss," Wyatt said, dropping his hands and stepping back quickly. "I didn't see you there." The young woman was perhaps 20 years old, with deep brown eyes that widened as she looked up at him. Her golden blonde hair was partially contained in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame her heart-shaped face. She wore a simple blue dress with a white collar, modest but well-fitted, suggesting someone who cared about appearances without being ostentatious. "The fault is entirely mine," she replied, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "I was not watching where I was going." Wyatt knelt to retrieve her scattered books, noticing titles on medicine and anatomy among them. When he glanced up questioningly, a slight blush colored her cheeks. "I assist my father," she explained. "He's the doctor here." "That's so," Wyatt handed the stack back to her. "Well, I hope to have no need of either of you during my stay." She smiled, revealing a small dimple in her right cheek. "I'm Josephine Blackwell. Most everyone calls me Josie." Wyatt Morgan, he tipped his hat slightly, already retreating. "Good day, Miss Blackwell." As he walked away, Wyatt felt an unexpected urge to look back. He resisted it, squaring his shoulders and quickening his pace. Cottonwood Springs was just another town, and she was just another person he would leave behind when he moved on. That was the way of things. The only way that made sense in a world where permanence was a dangerous illusion. Still, as he secured a room at the boarding house and finally sank into a steaming bath, her smile lingered in his thoughts. It was a distraction he could ill afford. Tomorrow, he told himself firmly, he would collect his wages and ride out. There was nothing for him here, but fate rarely concerns itself with a man's plans, especially in the West. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Wyatt made his way to the cattle company office only to discover that the owner, Mr. Caldwell, had been delayed returning from Cheyenne. The clerk advised him to return in 3 days when payment would be distributed to all the drovers. 3 days. Wyatt's jaw tightened in frustration. 3 days in a town where he already felt too visible, too noticed. He considered riding out anyway, but the wages from 3 months' work were too substantial to abandon. With reluctance, he decided to make the best of his forced delay. He would resupply, rest Shadow, and keep to himself. Simple enough. By mid-afternoon, he was sitting alone in the town's small cafe, nursing a cup of coffee, when shouting erupted outside. The sound of pounding hooves was followed by panic screams. Wyatt was on his feet in an instant, hand dropping instinctively to his revolver as he moved to the window. A wagon was careening down the main street, horses in a full panic, the driver nowhere to be seen. A small boy stood frozen in their path, too terrified to move. Wyatt was through the door before conscious thought caught up to his instincts. He sprinted toward the child, calculating distances and odds in the back of his mind. It would be close, too close. Just as he reached the boy, scooping him up in one powerful movement, Wyatt's boot caught in a rut. He managed to toss the child clear, but couldn't regain his balance in time. The wagon's horses were nearly upon him, their wild eyes rolling in terror. Something slammed into him from the side, rolling him out of the path of the deadly hooves. For a moment all was confusion and dust. Then Wyatt found himself lying in the dirt at the edge of the street. A warm weight sprawled across his chest. Blonde hair obscured his vision. "Miss Blackwell," he gasped, recognizing his rescuer. Josephine pushed herself up, her face inches from his. "Mr. Morgan, it seems we keep colliding." Their eyes locked, and something electric passed between them. Then awareness of their compromising position flooded Josephine's face. She scrambled to her feet, hastily brushing dust from her green dress as curious onlookers gathered. "The boy?" Wyatt asked, standing more slowly. "Safe," she assured him, nodding toward where a woman was clutching the child, weeping with relief. "But you nearly got yourself killed." "As did you," he countered, studying her with new interest. Few men would have had the courage to do what she had just done, let alone a woman in a proper dress and half-boots clearly not designed for heroics. Josie, a tall, distinguished man with graying hair, pushed through the crowd. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Father," she replied. "Thanks to Mr. Morgan, he saved little Tommy Jenkins." Dr. Blackwell turned to Wyatt. "Then we owe you our gratitude, sir." "Tommy is my wife's nephew." Before Wyatt could respond, the doctor's eyes narrowed. "You're bleeding." Wyatt glanced down to see a tear in his sleeve, blood seeping through the fabric. In the chaos, he hadn't noticed the injury. "It's nothing," he said dismissively. "I'll be the judge of that," Dr. Blackwell replied firmly. "Come to my office. Josie, see to Tommy and Marjorie." Despite his protests, Wyatt found himself following the doctor to a small building off the main street. Inside was a well-organized medical office with an examination room in the back. As Dr. Blackwell cleaned and stitched the gash on Wyatt's arm, a result of sharp metal on the runaway wagon, he spoke of his 20 years in Cottonwood Springs. "Came out from Boston after the war," he explained. "My wife wanted somewhere quieter to raise our daughter, found more adventure than we bargained for, but I've never regretted it." Wyatt listened more than he spoke, as was his custom. But when the doctor asked what brought him to town, he found himself offering more than the bare minimum. "Cattle drive from Texas, been on the trail nearly 3 months." "And where will you head next?" The older man's hands were steady as he tied off the last stitch. Wyatt shrugged. "Wherever the work is." Dr. Blackwell studied him thoughtfully. A young man with quick reflexes and a cool head might find opportunities here. The territory's growing. "Good men are needed." "I don't stay anywhere long," Wyatt replied, more sharply than he'd intended. The doctor smiled slightly. "Of course, just an observation." He bandaged the wound efficiently. "Keep this clean. Come back in 3 days and I'll check it." As Wyatt reached for his wallet, the doctor waved him off. "You saved my nephew. Consider this payment for services rendered." The cowboy nodded, uncomfortable with the gesture, but unwilling to argue. As he rose to leave, the door opened and Josephine entered, now wearing a clean dress and with her hair neatly arranged. "Tommy is fine," she reported, more excited than frightened now that it's over. Her eyes moved to Wyatt's bandaged arm. "How bad?" 7 stitches, her father answered. "Clean cut, should heal well." "I was just leaving," Wyatt said, reaching for his hat. "Actually," Dr. Blackwell interjected, "we would be honored if you would join us for dinner tonight. My wife would like to thank you properly." Wyatt opened his mouth to refuse, but found himself looking at Josephine. The invitation in her eyes made the words stick in his throat. "I couldn't impose," he managed. "It's no imposition," she said. "Mother always cooks too much anyway, and I would like to hear about Texas. I've never been further south than Denver." Against every instinct that had kept him alive and alone for the past decade, Wyatt heard himself accepting. As he walked back to the boarding house to clean up, he told himself it was just politeness. One dinner and then he would be on his way as soon as he collected his wages. But deep in his chest, something long dormant stirred to life, a dangerous feeling he had no intention of examining too closely. The Blackwell home sat at the edge of town, a comfortable two-story house with a small garden that must have required considerable effort in the harsh Wyoming climate. Wyatt arrived precisely on time, dressed in his cleanest shirt and brushed jacket, his dark hair still damp from washing. Mrs. Blackwell was a small, energetic woman with the same blonde hair as her daughter, though hers was beginning to silver at the temples. She welcomed Wyatt with such genuine warmth that his usual reserve cracked slightly. "You must call me Martha," she insisted, taking his hat and showing him into a parlor that somehow managed to be both elegant and comfortable. "Any man who would risk himself for a child is family in our home." Throughout dinner, Wyatt found himself drawn into conversation, despite his best efforts to remain detached. The Blackwells asked about his experiences on the cattle drives without prying into his past. Josephine, seated across from him, had an unnerving ability to draw him out with thoughtful questions and genuine interest in his answers. "Have you always been a cowboy?" she asked as Martha served apple pie. "No," Wyatt hesitated, then continued reluctantly. "My father had a small ranch in Texas. After he died, I couldn't keep it going alone." "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes softening with empathy rather than pity. "Was that when you started driving cattle?" Wyatt nodded. "Started as a wrangler at 16. Worked my way up." "And your mother?" Martha asked gently. "Followed my father too quickly." The words came out clipped. "It's been just me since then." An uncomfortable silence fell, but Josephine rescued the moment. "Father says you'll be in town a few days. Perhaps tomorrow you might show me how to properly saddle a horse. I'm afraid our stable boy has been teaching me, but father says my technique is dreadful." Dr. Blackwell looked startled, then amused. "I said no such thing, but the lesson would certainly be welcome. Josie rides well enough, but has little patience for the preparations." "I could do that," Wyatt agreed, surprising himself again. When he left that evening, with Martha's insistence that he return the following night still ringing in his ears, Wyatt tried to make sense of his own actions. He had intended to be polite, nothing more. Instead, he'd spent 3 hours in animated conversation, agreed to give a riding lesson, and somehow committed to a second dinner. As he lay in his boarding house bed that night, Wyatt told himself firmly that these people meant nothing to him. They were kind, certainly, but kindness was often a prelude to expectation. Once they realized he had nothing to offer, no property, no prospects beyond the next job, and certainly no intention of settling down, their interest would fade. It would be better to maintain his distance. Safer, smarter. Yet the next morning found him at the Blackwells' small stable behind their house, where Josephine was waiting in a practical riding skirt and boots, her hair braided down her back. "I half expected you wouldn't come," she admitted as he approached. "I gave my word," Wyatt replied simply. She smiled. "So you did. Well, here's Daisy." She gestured to a gentle-looking bay mare. "Show me how a proper cowboy saddles a horse." What had begun as a simple demonstration turned into a morning-long ride through the countryside surrounding Cottonwood Springs. Josephine was a better rider than she had implied, sitting her horse with natural grace as she pointed out landmarks and shared stories of growing up in the small frontier town. "Father brings me on his rounds sometimes," she explained as they rode past a distant farmhouse. "I've been learning medicine since I was 12. He believes women can be doctors too, though the medical schools disagree." "You want to be a doctor?" Wyatt asked, genuinely curious. "More than anything," she replied, her expression growing serious. "I've already learned more through apprenticeship than many medical students, but without formal training, I'll never be accepted as anything more than a nurse or midwife." "That seems unfair." She glanced at him, clearly surprised by his response. "Most men think the idea absurd." "Most men haven't seen what I've seen," Wyatt replied, thinking of women he'd encountered who ran ranches, defended homesteads, and performed surgery with nothing but kitchen knives when necessary. "Out here, ability matters more than what's between your ears." They stopped by a small creek to rest the horses. As they sat on sun-warmed rocks, watching the clear water tumble over stones, Wyatt found himself speaking of things he rarely mentioned: his father's dreams for their Texas ranch, his mother's garden that had withered after her death, the decision to sell the land that had been in his family for 2 generations. "Have you ever thought of starting over?" Josephine asked. "Finding new land, building something for yourself?" Wyatt tossed a pebble into the creek. "A man needs money for that, and roots mean vulnerability." "Is that why you keep moving?" to avoid being vulnerable. Her question struck too close to truths he preferred not to examine. Wyatt stood abruptly. We should head back, your parents will worry. Josephine's eyes reflected disappointment, but she nodded and rose to mount her horse. They rode back in silence, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of their outward journey. Something had shifted between them, a line crossed that Wyatt hadn't meant to approach, let alone traverse. That evening at dinner he was more reserved, speaking when addressed but offering little. If the Blackwells noticed the change, they were too polite to mention it. When Martha invited him to attend church with them the following morning, he declined as graciously as possible, citing the need to check on his horse and prepare for his departure once Mr. Caldwell returned. Of course, Martha said, her smile unchanged despite his refusal, but remember, you're welcome anytime. As Wyatt walked back to the boarding house under a sky brilliant with stars, he felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest. These people had shown him nothing but kindness, expecting nothing in return. Josephine's interest seemed genuine, her conversation stimulating, her beauty more compelling with each encounter. It would be so easy to imagine more, to picture himself staying, finding work locally, calling on her properly. Perhaps in time, building a life that included more than solitude and survival, but such thoughts were dangerous fantasies. Men like him didn't settle down with educated doctors' daughters. Men like him didn't settle at all. Tomorrow he would keep his distance. The day after he would collect his wages and ride out. End of story. Fate, however, had other plans. Wyatt spent Sunday morning at the livery, grooming Shadow and helping the stable boy repair a broken stall door. He deliberately avoided the main street during church hours and took his midday meal at the small saloon rather than the cafe where he might encounter the Blackwells. By afternoon, he was restless, trapped between the desire to seek out Josephine and the certainty that doing so would be a mistake. He decided to check the cattle company office on the slim chance that Mr. Caldwell had returned early. As he approached the mercantile store next to the office, the sound of raised voices caught his attention. He rounded the corner to find 3 roughly dressed men confronting a frightened clerk on the store's porch. "I don't want any trouble," the clerk was saying, hands raised placatingly. "Then open the safe," growled the tallest of the 3 men, his hand hovering near a holstered pistol. "Sunday's a good day for collections. Everyone at church nice and peaceful." Wyatt assessed the situation quickly. These were not local cowboys blowing off steam but professional troublemakers, the kind who drifted from town to town, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. The kind of men who had killed his father and left his mother to wither from grief. His hand moved to his revolver. "Gentlemen," he called, stepping into view, "the store appears closed for Sunday. Perhaps you should come back tomorrow." 3 heads swiveled toward him. The leader's eyes narrowed as he took in Wyatt's stance. "Mind your business, stranger," he advised, "unless you're looking to get hurt." "Funny," Wyatt replied evenly. "I was about to suggest the same to you." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the leader grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. 3 against 1. Bad odds, cowboy. "For you," Wyatt agreed. "You only get to draw first. I get to shoot first." The confidence in his voice made the other men hesitate. Wyatt knew his reputation wasn't riding with him here. No one in Cottonwood Springs knew he had served as a deputy marshal in Kansas for 8 months, or that he had tracked rustlers for the large spreads in Texas, or that his ability with a gun was the result of daily practice since he was 14 years old. But something in his eyes must have conveyed the truth, because the leader's smile faded. "Come on," he muttered to his companions. "Too many busybodies in this town anyway." They backed away, maintaining threatening glares but making no move toward their weapons. Wyatt watched until they mounted horses tied at the edge of town and rode out, only then releasing the breath he'd been holding. The clerk approached cautiously. "Thank you, mister. Those men have been hanging around for 2 days, making everyone nervous. I should get the sheriff." "You do that," Wyatt agreed. "Tell him they're headed south, but they might circle back." Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the small town. By evening, when Wyatt reluctantly presented himself at the Blackwell home for dinner as promised, Martha greeted him as though he'd single-handedly saved the entire community. "Everyone's talking about how you faced down those awful men," she exclaimed, ushering him inside. "Dr. Reynolds was just leaving the mercantile and saw the whole thing. He said you were as cool as ice." "It was nothing," Wyatt insisted, uncomfortable with the attention. They were looking for easy pickings, not a fight. Nevertheless, Dr. Blackwell said, entering from his study, you've done this town a service. Those men robbed a store in Laramie last month. The sheriff recognized the description. Josephine appeared in the doorway to the dining room, wearing a rose-colored dress that complemented the flush in her cheeks. It seems you make a habit of rescuing people, Mr. Morgan. Wyatt, he corrected automatically, and no, I don't, just happen to be there. Her smile suggested she didn't believe his dismissal, but was too polite to argue. Throughout dinner, Wyatt was aware of her watching him, her intelligent eyes seeming to see past his carefully constructed barriers. After the meal, when Martha insisted on showing Dr. Blackwell something in the kitchen, Josephine invited Wyatt to see her father's library. The small room was lined with bookshelves containing not only medical texts, but also volumes of history, philosophy, and literature. Father believes in a well-rounded education, she explained, trailing her fingers along the spines of several books, for me as well as himself. You're fortunate, Wyatt observed. Most women don't get such opportunities. I know, she turned to face him directly, just as I know you're not simply a drifting cowboy, regardless of what you want people to believe. Wyatt stiffened. What makes you say that? The way you handle yourself, the way you speak when you forget to be guarded, the fact that you can face down armed robbers without flinching but look terrified at the prospect of pleasant conversation. Her directness was softened by a gentle smile. You're running from something, Wyatt Morgan, or perhaps towards something you haven't identified yet. For a moment he considered denying it, then, looking into her perceptive eyes, he sighed, both maybe. I don't know anymore. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair. Would it be so terrible to stop running, to stay somewhere long enough to discover what you actually want? I've never known anywhere worth staying, he admitted, his voice low. Then, almost against his will, he added, until now, perhaps. The admission hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Josephine's eyes widened slightly, and for a heartbeat, Wyatt thought she might step closer still. Instead, Martha's voice called from the hallway, Josie, your father needs help organizing his medical bag for tomorrow's rounds. The moment broken, Josephine stepped back. Coming, mother, to Wyatt, she added quietly, think about what I said, not everything worth having requires running away. That night, Wyatt lay awake in his boarding house room, replaying their conversation. Josephine had seen through him with disturbing ease, identifying the restlessness that had driven him from place to place for years. The truth was, he hadn't just been running from painful memories or the responsibilities of settling down. He'd been running from the possibility of caring too deeply, of building something that could be destroyed, of loving someone who might be taken away. His father had died protecting their land and family. His mother had died from the grief of losing him. The lesson had seemed clear. Attachment led to pain. Caring too much was a fatal weakness. But watching the Blackwells, their evident affection for each other, their welcoming home, their place in the community, made him wonder if he'd drawn the wrong conclusion. Perhaps the tragedy wasn't in loving deeply, but in failing to recognize the value of what remained. His mother had had him, after all. They could have built something new together if grief hadn't blinded her to the possibility. These thoughts chased themselves in circles until dawn lightened the sky. By the time Wyatt dressed and headed to the cattle company office, he was no closer to a decision, but was increasingly certain he faced one. Mr. Caldwell had indeed returned. The payment process took most of the morning, with each drover receiving his wages and signing a receipt. When Wyatt's turn came, the cattle boss counted out his money, then paused. Morgan, isn't it? Wrangler and night guard. Yes, sir. Caldwell nodded. Trail boss spoke highly of you. Said you've got a good eye for cattle and know how to handle men. I'm putting together another drive next month, shorter run, just to Denver. Could use a reliable segundo. The offer was unexpected. Second in command was a position of responsibility, with better pay and the potential for advancement. It was the kind of opportunity Wyatt would normally grab without hesitation. When would you need an answer? He asked. End of the week, Caldwell replied. I'll be here until Friday. Wyatt pocketed his wages and left, his thoughts more turbulent than before. Now he had a concrete reason to stay in Cottonwood Springs, at least temporarily. The question was whether that was what he truly wanted. His feet carried him automatically toward Dr. Blackwell's office for the promised check of his stitches. As he approached, he saw Josephine emerging from the building, medical bag in hand. When she spotted him, her face brightened. "Perfect timing," she called. "Father was called to a difficult berth outside town. I was just heading to check on Mrs. Finch's broken wrist. Would you mind accompanying me? It's not far, but Father prefers I not make house calls alone." "I was coming to have my stitches checked," Wyatt explained. "I can do that too," she assured him. "I've removed more stitches than I can count." Seeing his hesitation, she added, "Unless you'd rather wait for Father. He might not be back until evening." "No, that's fine," Wyatt decided. "I'll walk with you." As they made their way through town, Josephine greeted nearly everyone they passed, clearly well known and respected despite her youth. Several people called out thanks to Wyatt for his handling of the would-be robbers, increasing his discomfort. "You don't like recognition," Josephine observed as they turned onto a quieter street. "I prefer to blend in," he admitted. "Attention can be dangerous." "Not all attention," she countered. "Community means being seen, the good and the bad. It means belonging somewhere, having people who would notice if you disappeared." The concept was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. Wyatt had spent so long ensuring he left no meaningful trace that the idea of being important enough to miss was almost inconceivable. At Mrs. Finch's modest home, Wyatt watched as Josephine transformed from the somewhat provocative conversationalist into a competent medical professional. She examined the older woman's wrist with gentle efficiency, explaining each step of her assessment and demonstrating exercises to prevent stiffness. "You have a natural gift, Miss Blackwell," Mrs. Finch said admiringly, "just like your father." "She's a good teacher," Josephine replied with a smile, "and I had an excellent teacher." After they left, Josephine insisted on examining Wyatt's arm in the privacy of her father's office. Her touch was clinical but gentle as she removed the bandage and inspected the healing wound. "These can come out now," she decided, gathering the necessary tools. "The cut is healing cleanly." As she worked, Wyatt studied her face, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows, the firm set of her mouth, the absolute confidence in her movements. This was a woman who knew her purpose, who had built her life around meaningful work and connection to others. "You're staring," she noted without looking up from her task. "You're impressive," he replied honestly. "Most men I know couldn't do what you just did with Mrs. Finch. The medical skill, yes, but also the way you made her feel cared for." Josephine's hands paused momentarily. "Thank you," she said, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. "Most men see my interest in medicine as an odd hobby, at best, something to occupy me until marriage redirects my attention." "Is that what you want? Marriage instead of medicine?" "I want both," she answered simply, resuming her work. "A partnership with someone who values my abilities rather than seeking to limit them. But such men are rare, especially out here." She tied off the last stitch and looked up at him. "There, good as new, though you'll have a scar." "One more won't make much difference," Wyatt said, rolling down his sleeve. "Thank you. Will you stay for dinner again tonight?" The question was casual, but her eyes held his intently. Wyatt hesitated. Each encounter with Josephine and her family pulled him deeper into their world, making the inevitable departure more difficult. The smart choice would be to decline, to create distance now. "Caldwell offered me a job," he found himself saying instead, "as segundo on a drive to Denver next month. Means I'd be here a few more weeks." Josephine's expression brightened. "That's wonderful. Will you take it?" "Haven't decided," Wyatt admitted. "There's always work somewhere." "But not always friends," she pointed out softly. "Not always people who see your worth." Before Wyatt could respond, the office door opened and Dr. Blackwell entered looking tired but satisfied. "A healthy baby boy," he announced. 8 pounds if he's an ounce. Noticing Wyatt, he added, "Ah, for your stitches. I see Josie's already taken care of it." "She did an excellent job," Wyatt confirmed. "Of course she did. She has steadier hands than mine these days." The doctor's proud smile encompassed his daughter. "Will you join us for dinner, Mr. Morgan? Martha is preparing her famous beef stew." And just like that, Wyatt found himself accepting again, drawn by the warmth of this family and the increasingly undeniable connection he felt to Josephine. That evening's dinner was more relaxed than previous occasions. with Dr. Blackwell sharing amusing stories from his early days in medicine, and Martha revealing that she had once scandalized her Boston family by announcing her intention to marry a country doctor and move west. They were certain I would perish within a year, she recalled with a laugh. My mother packed 12 pairs of gloves, as though proper handwear would somehow protect me from Indians and outlaws. And here you are 20 years later, her husband said fondly. With no regrets, Martha confirmed. Well, perhaps one, that my family never came to visit. They missed seeing the wonderful life we built here, all because they were afraid of the unknown. The pointed look she gave Wyatt suggested the story wasn't shared merely for entertainment. He shifted uncomfortably, aware that his own reluctance to put down roots stemmed from similar fears, though differently directed. After dinner, when Martha insisted on showing Josephine something in the kitchen, Dr. Blackwell invited Wyatt to join him for a pipe on the porch. As they sat in the gathering dusk, the older man broke their companionable silence. I understand Caldwell offered you a position. Wyatt nodded. News travels fast. Small towns, the doctor agreed with a shrug. For better or worse, people take an interest in each other's affairs. He tamped tobacco into his pipe thoughtfully. It's a good opportunity, from what I hear. It is, Wyatt confirmed, though I haven't decided yet. Dr. Blackwell lit his pipe and puffed a few times before speaking again. May I offer some unsolicited advice? From a man who once faced a similar choice. Curious despite himself, Wyatt nodded. When I met Martha, I was committed to a prestigious hospital position in Philadelphia. Marriage to a Boston society girl and a move to Wyoming Territory weren't in my plans. The doctor smiled at the memory. I nearly let fear of the unknown keep me from the greatest joy of my life. It wasn't just Martha, though she would have been reason enough. It was the chance to build something meaningful, to be needed in a way the big city hospital never required. He gestured around at the small towns spread below them. These people trust me with their lives. I've delivered their children, set their broken bones, eased their passing when nothing else could be done. There's a purpose in that kind of work that goes beyond mere survival. Wyatt considered the doctor's words. And you never regretted leaving Philadelphia behind. Not once, Dr. Blackwell answered firmly. The path isn't always easy, but it's mine. I chose it, eyes open, instead of simply drifting where circumstances pushed me. He knocked the ash from his pipe. That's the real question, isn't it? Not where you're going, but whether you're choosing your direction or just letting the current carry you. Before Wyatt could respond, Josephine stepped onto the porch. Mother sent me to see if you wanted coffee, she explained, but her eyes were on Wyatt. I should get back to town, he said, rising. Thank you for dinner and for the conversation. Dr. Blackwell nodded, a knowing gleam in his eye. Think about what I said. I'll walk you to the gate, Josephine offered. In the deepening twilight, they strolled slowly toward the front gate. When they reached it, Josephine turned to face him. You're leaving, aren't you? She asked directly. Not just tonight, but soon. I can see it in your face. Wyatt sighed. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted. That's the truth. Everything I thought I understood about my life seems less certain now. Because of Cottonwood Springs, or because of me? The boldness of her question startled him, but the vulnerability in her eyes prevented any pretense of misunderstanding. Both, he answered honestly. You and your family have shown me a kind of life I convinced myself wasn't possible, or at least not possible for me. Why not for you? Because I've spent 10 years making sure I never stayed anywhere long enough to care. Because the last time I had a home, I lost it. Because I'm not sure I remember how to belong somewhere. The words spilled out before he could stop them. Josephine's expression softened. Those are all reasons to leave, she acknowledged. But are they stronger than the reasons to stay? Before he could answer, she continued, I'm not asking for promises, Wyatt, just a chance. Take the job with Caldwell, stay a few weeks. See if what you feel now grows stronger or fades. If you still want to leave after that, at least you'll know you made a choice instead of running from one. She stepped closer, her face upturned to his. In the silver moonlight, she was achingly beautiful, strong and vulnerable in equal measure. And if I decide to stay, he asked, his voice rough with emotions he'd denied for too long. Then we see where this leads, she whispered. Together. For a moment that contained a lifetime of possibility, they stood facing each other, the distance between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then, with a gentleness that belied the strength in his weathered hands, Wyatt reached up to touch her cheek. "I'll take the job," he said softly. "The rest, we'll see." Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "That's all I'm asking for." As Wyatt walked back to town under a canopy of stars, he felt lighter than he had in years. No promises had been made beyond the next few weeks, yet somehow, the world seemed full of possibilities rather than threats. For the first time since his father's death, Wyatt Morgan was riding toward something instead of away from it. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. What he couldn't know, was that the true test of his newfound courage was still to come. The following days established a pattern that began to feel like the foundation of a life rather than a temporary arrangement. Wyatt accepted Caldwell's offer and found work at the livery stable to occupy his time until the cattle drive. In the evenings, he often found himself at the Blackwell home, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk with Josephine. Their conversations ranged widely, from her medical studies to his experiences on the cattle trails, from books they had both read to dreams they had each harbored privately until now. With each exchange, the connection between them deepened, evolving from interest to genuine affection to something neither was quite ready to name, but both increasingly relied upon. A week after accepting the job, Wyatt was repairing a saddle at the livery when a commotion on the main street drew his attention. He stepped outside to see a group of riders entering town, rough-looking men led by a familiar figure. The leader of the would-be robbers had returned, this time with more than 2 companions. Wyatt retreated into the shadows of the livery doorway, watching as the men dismounted outside the saloon. There were 6 of them now, all armed, their manner suggesting they hadn't come for a peaceful drink. Moving quietly, Wyatt made his way to the sheriff's office. The young deputy on duty looked up from his desk with surprise as Wyatt entered. "Those men who tried to rob the mercantile last week are back," Wyatt informed him. 6 of them now over at the saloon. Looks like trouble." The deputy's face paled. "Sheriff's out at the Peterson place. Won't be back till tomorrow." "Then you'd better round up some men," Wyatt advised. "I don't think those fellows are here for the scenery." As the deputy hurried to organize a response, Wyatt debated his own course of action. The smart move would be to stay out of it. This wasn't his town, these weren't his people, and he had no official standing to intervene. But even as he thought it, Wyatt knew he was lying to himself. Cottonwood Springs had become more than just another stop on an endless journey. The Blackwells had become more than just a friendly family. And Josephine, she had become central to a future he was only now allowing himself to imagine. With a resigned sigh, Wyatt checked his revolver and headed toward the saloon. He would keep his distance, observe the situation, and step in only if absolutely necessary. That plan lasted approximately 3 minutes, until he saw 2 of the newcomers heading directly toward Dr. Blackwell's office, where Josephine would be assisting her father with afternoon patients. Moving swiftly, Wyatt intercepted them before they reached the office door. "Can I help you gentlemen find something?" he asked, his hand resting casually near his holster. The men turned, recognition and animosity flaring in their eyes as they identified him. "Well, if it ain't the hero," sneered the taller of the 2. "Funny meeting you again." "Not really," Wyatt replied evenly. "I'm still here, you still looking for easy pickings." The second man spat tobacco juice on the boardwalk. "Boss wants to talk to you, says you cost us a good score last week." "Your boss should find a new line of work," Wyatt suggested, "before someone gets hurt." Both men tensed at the implicit threat. "You threatening us, Cowboy?" the first man demanded. "Just stating facts," Wyatt said. "Now, why don't you head back to the saloon? Whatever you want at the doctor's office can wait." The standoff might have escalated immediately if Dr. Blackwell hadn't chosen that moment to open his office door. "Wyatt, is everything all right?" The distraction was momentary but sufficient. The 2 men exchanged glances, then backed away. "This ain't over," the taller one promised before they retreated toward the saloon. Dr. Blackwell stepped onto the boardwalk, concern etching his features. "Those are the men from before." Wyatt nodded grimly, "With friends. You and Josephine should stay inside. Lock the doors. Where's Mrs. Blackwell?" "At home," the doctor replied. "Should I send for her?" "No, better she stays there for now." Wyatt glanced toward the saloon, where the deputy was cautiously approaching with only 2 volunteers. This could get ugly. Before either man could say more, gunshots erupted from the saloon. Wyatt pushed Dr. Blackwell back into the office. "Stay here," he ordered, then ran toward the commotion. The scene that greeted him was chaos. One of the volunteers was down, clutching a bleeding arm. The deputy was taking cover behind a water trough, exchanging fire with the outlaws who had overturned tables inside the saloon. The second volunteer was nowhere to be seen. Wyatt drew his revolver and moved to flank the saloon, using buildings for cover. As he neared the rear exit, the door burst open, and two of the outlaws emerged, clearly planning to circle around and trap the deputy. They weren't expecting Wyatt. His first shot caught the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second outlaw fired wildly in Wyatt's direction before retreating back into the saloon. The wounded leader dropped his gun, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You shot me, you son of a bitch." "Be grateful I didn't aim for your heart," Wyatt replied coldly, kicking the fallen weapon out of reach. "Now call off your men before this gets worse." More gunfire from inside the saloon suggested the remaining outlaws weren't inclined to surrender. Wyatt secured the wounded man to a hitching post with his own belt, then moved carefully toward the front of the building. The deputy spotted him and signaled frantically. Understanding the gesture, Wyatt provided covering fire while the young lawman dashed to a better position. Together, they began to coordinate their approach, gradually forcing the outlaws to expend ammunition and limiting their options for escape. What neither man anticipated was the sixth outlaw, who had apparently slipped away during the initial confusion. Wyatt's first warning was a sharp pain as a bullet grazed his side. He dove for cover, returning fire instinctively. The hidden shooter fell from the roof of the adjacent building, landing hard on the street below. He didn't move again. For a tense minute, silence fell. Then, from inside the saloon, a voice called out, "We're coming out." "Don't shoot." The remaining three outlaws emerged slowly, hands raised. The deputy and townsmen who had joined the fight quickly disarmed and restrained them. As the immediate danger passed, Wyatt became aware of the warm wetness spreading across his shirt. The bullet graze was deeper than he'd initially thought. Pressing a hand to his side, he made his way back toward Dr. Blackwell's office. He was halfway there when Josephine rushed out, medical bag in hand, her face pale with fear. "Wyatt," she cried, seeing the blood seeping between his fingers. "Father, he's hurt." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and professional activity, as Dr. Blackwell treated his wound along with those sustained by others during the shootout. The bullet had carved a deep furrow across Wyatt's ribs but hadn't penetrated his chest. Painful, the doctor assured him, but not life-threatening with proper care. Throughout the treatment, Josephine remained at her father's side, her hands steady despite the worry evident in her eyes. When the wound was finally cleaned, stitched, and bandaged, she insisted that Wyatt stay at their home rather than return to his boarding house room. "You need proper monitoring," she argued when he protested, "and our spare room is more comfortable than that lumpy boarding house bed." Too weak from blood loss to argue effectively, Wyatt reluctantly agreed. By nightfall, he was installed in the Blackwells' guest room, with strict instructions to rest and allow his body to heal. As darkness settled over the house, Wyatt lay awake, his side throbbing despite the laudanum doctor. Blackwell had prescribed. The day's events replayed in his mind, particularly the moment when he'd seen those men heading toward the doctor's office, toward Josephine. The fury and fear that had surged through him then had nothing to do with abstract notions of right and wrong. It had been deeply personally protective, the instinctive response of a man defending what he valued most, and therein lay the truth he could no longer deny. Somewhere along the line, Josephine Blackwell had become essential to him. The thought of harm coming to her was unbearable. The prospect of leaving her behind was increasingly inconceivable. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Are you awake?" Josephine's voice was barely above a whisper. "Come in," he answered, struggling to sit up against the pillows. She entered carrying a tray with a cup of tea and a small bottle. "Father thought you might need something more for the pain," she explained, setting the tray on the bedside table. "The laudanum can make your thoughts fuzzy, but this willow bark tea helps without clouding your mind as much." Wyatt accepted the cup gratefully. "Thank you." Josephine perched on the edge of the chair beside the bed, her eyes searching his face. "You could have been killed today." "It wasn't that serious," he assured her. "Not the wound," she clarified, "the situation." "Taking on 6 armed men, why would you do that?" Wyatt considered several possible answers before settling on the truth. Because they were heading toward your father's office, toward you. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Josephine's eyes widened slightly, then softened with an emotion Wyatt wasn't ready to name, but desperately hoped he wasn't misinterpreting. "You were protecting me," she said softly. "I was protecting what matters," he amended, holding her gaze. "What matters most." The distinction might have seemed subtle to anyone else, but Josephine understood immediately. Her breath caught, and for a moment neither spoke. Then with deliberate care she took the teacup from his hands and set it aside. "Wyatt Morgan," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions visible in her eyes, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words struck him like a physical blow, not painful but shocking in their impact, in the way they rearranged everything he thought he knew about himself and his future. "Josephine," he began, then faltered, unaccustomed to articulating feelings he'd spent a decade suppressing. "I don't know how to do this. I've spent so long running, I'm not sure I remember how to stay." "Then I'll remind you," she said simply, "every day if necessary." She leaned forward, her intent clear. Wyatt met her halfway, his hand coming up to cradle her face as their lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and profound, a promise neither had expected to make but both now embraced without reservation. When they parted, Josephine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Rest now," she whispered. "We have time to figure out the rest." As she slipped from the room, Wyatt sank back against the pillows, overwhelmed by the certainty that had replaced his chronic restlessness. Whatever came next, he would face it here with her. The decision he'd been wrestling with had made itself. The next morning brought both clarity and complications. News arrived that the leader of the outlaw gang was wanted for murder in Colorado. The wounded men would be transported to Cheyenne for trial as soon as they were stable enough to travel. Sheriff Turner, returned from his trip to the Peterson farm, personally visited the Blackwell home to take Wyatt's statement and thank him for his assistance. "Town council's talking about offering you a deputy position," the sheriff mentioned as he prepared to leave. "Could use a man with your skills and cool head." The offer was unexpected but not unwelcome. Wyatt had been considering how to balance the promised cattle drive with his desire to remain near Josephine. A position in town would solve that dilemma neatly. Before he could respond, however, a writer arrived with an urgent message. The young man, dust covered from hard writing, asked for Dr. Blackwell, then hesitated when he saw the sheriff. "What is it, boy?" Sheriff Turner demanded. "Speak up." "There's been trouble at the Circle M ranch," the messenger explained. "Mr. Mitchell was shot. His son sent me for the doctor, and to warn the town that Jake Thorpe and his gang might be heading this way." The name sent a chill through Wyatt. Jake Thorpe was notorious throughout the territory, a ruthless outlaw who had graduated from cattle rustling to increasingly violent robberies. More significantly, Thorpe had once been part of the gang that had raided small ranches in Texas years before, the same gang responsible for the attack that had killed Wyatt's father. "Thorpe," Wyatt repeated, his voice tight. "You're certain?" The messenger nodded. Mr. Mitchell recognized him, said he'd dealt with him before when he was foreman at the Bar T in Texas. The confirmation hit Wyatt like a physical blow. Mitchell had been his father's closest friend, one of the few who had offered help after the Morgan ranch was destroyed. If Thorpe had targeted him specifically, it suggested a pattern rather than random violence. "Doctor." Blackwell was already gathering his medical bag. "I'll need to go immediately. Josie, prepare my surgical tools." "I'm coming with you," Wyatt declared, struggling to stand despite his injury. "You're in no condition," the doctor began, but Wyatt cut him off. "Thorpe was part of the gang that killed my father," he explained grimly. "If he's targeting Mitchell, it might be connected." "I need to talk to him." The revelation silenced the room. Dr. Blackwell exchanged a glance with the sheriff, who nodded slowly. "I'll send 2 deputies with you," Sheriff Turner decided. "Morgan can ride in your wagon, Doc. But he stays out of any fighting." Wyatt wanted to protest, but knew he was in no shape for a confrontation. The wound in his side throbbed painfully at even the slightest movement. Still, he had to go. Mitchell might have information that would finally bring closure to the loss that had defined Wyatt's life for so long. Within half an hour, the wagon was ready. Josephine, after a heated discussion with her father, was permitted to accompany them to assist with medical treatment. As they prepared to depart, she helped Wyatt settle in the back of the wagon. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "Your wound could reopen." I have to know, he replied, his expression haunted. I've spent 10 years trying to outrun what happened to my family. If there's a chance to finally understand why, to maybe even see justice done, I have to take it. Josephine studied his face, then nodded. I understand, but promise me you won't do anything reckless. With you watching over me, I wouldn't dare, he answered, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The journey to the Circle M ranch took nearly 2 hours over rough terrain. By the time they arrived, Wyatt's side was bleeding again, and his face had taken on a gray pallor that concerned both Blackwells. But his determination never wavered. The ranch house bore evidence of a violent attack: broken windows, bullet holes in the walls, and bloodstains on the porch. Inside, they found Robert Mitchell, a man in his 60s, lying pale and still on a makeshift bed. His son Thomas, roughly Wyatt's age, looked up with desperate hope as they entered. Doc Blackwell, he breathed, thank God. While the doctor and Josephine immediately began examining the wounded man, Wyatt leaned heavily against the doorframe. Thomas, he greeted quietly, it's been a long time. Thomas Mitchell's eyes widened in recognition. Wyatt Morgan, what on earth? I heard Thorpe was involved, Wyatt explained. I need to know if it's connected to what happened at my father's ranch. Understanding dawned in Thomas's tired eyes. Pa said something before he lost consciousness, said Thorpe mentioned finishing old business and asked about the Morgan place. He shook his head. I didn't understand the reference. Wyatt's jaw tightened. I do. Where did they go after the attack? Headed northwest toward the mountains, 6 or 7 men. Thomas hesitated. Wyatt, they're dangerous. More so than they were back in Texas. Thorpe's developed a taste for killing. Before Wyatt could respond, Dr. Blackwell called him over. Morgan, come here, Robert's conscious. Wyatt approached the bed where the older man lay, his chest wrapped in bloody bandages. Mitchell's eyes were clouded with pain but cleared slightly when he recognized Wyatt. John Morgan's boy, he whispered, grew up strong like your pa. Mr. Mitchell, Wyatt acknowledged, kneeling despite the pain it caused his own wound. What happened? The dying man, for it was clear now that Mitchell would not survive his injuries, reached weakly for Wyatt's hand. Thorpe came looking for something, said your pa took something that belonged to them, map or papers, I couldn't understand all of it. Wyatt frowned. My father never mentioned anything like that. He wouldn't have, Mitchell agreed, his breathing growing labored. Was trying to protect you, but Thorpe thinks you have it now, said he's been tracking Morgan survivors, you're the last. The implications chilled Wyatt to the bone. If Thorpe had been systematically eliminating people connected to whatever mysterious item his father had supposedly taken, then his appearance near Cottonwood Springs was no coincidence. Somehow the outlaw had learned of Wyatt's presence and come looking for him, and in doing so had put everyone Wyatt cared about in danger. Dr. Blackwell administered morphine to ease Mitchell's pain, then drew Wyatt and Josephine aside. There's nothing more I can do, he said quietly. The bullet tore through his lung. It's a miracle he's survived this long. Wyatt nodded grimly. How long does he have? Hours at most, the doctor replied. I'm sorry, Morgan. I know he was a friend of your father's. As the doctor returned to his patient, Josephine slipped her hand into Wyatt's. What will you do now? She asked softly. Wyatt stared at the wounded man, his mind racing. I need to lead Thorpe away from Cottonwood Springs, he decided. If he's looking for me, I can't let him bring his violence to the town. You're suggesting using yourself as bait, Josephine's voice sharpened with alarm. Wyatt, you're injured. You can't face these men alone. I won't face them at all if I can help it, he assured her. Just lead them on a chase long enough for the sheriff to organize a proper posse. But I have to get them away from people he broke off, then finished more quietly, from people I care about. Josephine's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back resolutely. Then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not, Wyatt said firmly. It's too dangerous. You're injured, she countered. Your wound is already bleeding again. Without medical attention, you'll be too weak to outride anyone within a day. Her chin lifted stubbornly. Besides, you need someone to watch your back while you sleep. You can't stay awake indefinitely. Wyatt wanted to refuse, to insist that she return to the safety of town with her father. But the practical part of him recognized the truth in her arguments. His side was bleeding again, and he wasn't in any condition to handle a prolonged pursuit alone. Your father will never agree, he pointed out. I'm 20 years old, Josephine replied with quiet determination. I make my own decisions. What followed was indeed a heated argument with Dr. Blackwell, who was adamantly opposed to his daughter riding off into potential danger. But Josephine was immovable, and in the end a compromise was reached. She and Wyatt would head east, away from the direction Thorpe had taken, and make for the nearest town with a telegraph. From there they could alert the territorial authorities and request assistance. 2 days, Dr. Blackwell insisted. You reach telegraph station by tomorrow night, send your message, and wait for the marshal there. If I don't receive word that you've arrived safely, I'm sending every man in the territory after you. Josephine embraced her father tightly. We'll be careful, she promised. And I'll make sure Wyatt doesn't tear his stitches again. As they prepared to depart, Thomas Mitchell approached Wyatt with a rifle and a small leather pouch. Pa wanted you to have these, he said. The rifle was your father's. He left it with us before the end, and the pouch has some papers Pa kept safe. Said if anything happened to him, they should go to you. Wyatt accepted both items with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. The rifle had indeed belonged to his father, a Winchester model 1873 that John Morgan had prized. The pouch, when Wyatt cautiously opened it, contained several folded documents and a small, hand-drawn map. Is this what Thorpe is looking for? He wondered aloud. Thomas shook his head. I don't know. Pa never showed me what was in there, just said it was important and that the Morgans had paid a high price for it. With no time to examine the contents thoroughly, Wyatt secured the pouch inside his shirt. Whatever secrets it contained would have to wait until they reached safety. The 2 deputies who had accompanied them from town agreed to escort Dr. Blackwell back to Cottonwood Springs with Mitchell's body. Wyatt and Josephine set out on fresh horses provided by Thomas, heading east as planned. They rode in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts. Wyatt was acutely aware of Josephine's presence behind him, of the trust she had placed in him by insisting on accompanying him. The responsibility weighed heavily, especially given his injured state. As the sun began to set, they stopped in a small copse of trees near a creek to rest the horses and check Wyatt's wound. It's bleeding again, Josephine observed as she carefully removed the bandage. Not badly, but enough to be concerned. You need to rest. Wyatt glanced at the darkening sky. We should make a few more miles before full dark. And risk you falling out of the saddle from exhaustion, she countered. No. We'll camp here where we have water and shelter. The horses need rest too. Recognizing the logic of her argument, Wyatt reluctantly agreed. While Josephine prepared a small, smokeless fire, he secured the horses and checked their back trail. There was no sign of pursuit yet, but Wyatt knew better than to assume they were safe. As night fell, they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from their saddlebags. Josephine had insisted on bringing medical supplies, which proved invaluable as she redressed Wyatt's wound. It's not infected, she assured him, applying a fresh bandage. But you've lost blood and the riding isn't helping. You need to rest. Wyatt caught her hand as she finished, holding it gently. Why did you really come with me? He asked quietly. The truth, Josephine. She met his gaze steadily. Because I meant what I said last night. I'm falling in love with you, Wyatt Morgan. And I refuse to let you face this alone when you're injured and grieving. The simple honesty of her answer left him momentarily speechless. When he found his voice again, it was rough with emotion. I don't deserve that kind of loyalty. It's not about deserving, Josephine replied. It's about choosing. I choose you, complications and all. Wyatt drew her closer, his free hand coming up to touch her cheek. I've spent 10 years running from connections, he admitted, telling myself I was safer alone. Then you walked into my life with your books and your medicine and your courage, and suddenly being alone doesn't seem safe anymore. It seems empty. In the flickering firelight, her eyes shone with unshed tears. Is that your way of saying you're falling in love with me too? It's my way of saying I already have, Wyatt answered, closing the distance between them to capture her lips in a kiss that expressed everything. He couldn't find words for his fear for her safety, his gratitude for her presence, his wonder at finding something he'd convinced himself didn't exist. When they finally parted, Josephine rested her forehead against his. We should sleep, she whispered. We have a long ride tomorrow. Despite his instinct to keep watch, Wyatt knew she was right about his need for rest. They arranged their bedrolls close together, and Josephine insisted on taking the first watch despite Wyatt's protests. "I'll wake you in 4 hours," she promised. "Now sleep." Doctor's orders. Exhaustion overtook him more quickly than he expected. As he drifted into slumber, Wyatt's last conscious thought was that, whatever happened next, the solitary life he had accepted as his fate was over. For better or worse, his heart was no longer his alone. He woke to Josephine's hand on his shoulder and the gray light of pre-dawn filtering through the trees. "Wyatt," she whispered urgently. "There are riders coming." Fully alert in an instant, Wyatt sat up, wincing at the pull of his wound. "How many?" "I counted 4, she replied, helping him to his feet. "Still a ways off, but moving steadily." "Could be Thorpe," Wyatt muttered, checking his father's rifle, "or could be innocent travelers. Either way, we should move." They packed quickly and mounted, Wyatt gritting his teeth against the pain in his side. As they rode east, he frequently checked behind them, but the trees obscured any view of their potential pursuers. By mid-morning, they emerged from the wooded area onto open prairie. The terrain offered better visibility but also left them exposed. In the distance, Telegraph Station was visible, a small collection of buildings perhaps 5 hours' ride away. "We should make it by mid-afternoon," Josephine observed, squinting at the horizon. Wyatt nodded, though his attention was on the dust cloud visible behind them. "We've got company," he said grimly, "and they're gaining." With their horses already tired, there was little hope of outrunning fresh mounts. Wyatt scanned the landscape, looking for defensive options. About a mile ahead, a rocky outcropping rose from the prairie floor, not ideal, but better than being caught in the open. "Head for those rocks," he instructed Josephine. "We'll make a stand there if we have to." They pushed their horses as hard as they dared, but the dust cloud behind them grew steadily larger. By the time they reached the outcropping, their pursuers were close enough that Wyatt could make out individual riders, 4 men, heavily armed, led by a figure he recognized from descriptions as Jake Thorpe himself. "Get behind the rocks," Wyatt ordered as they dismounted. "Take this." He handed Josephine his revolver, keeping his father's rifle for himself. "I won't leave you out here alone," she protested. "And I won't risk you being in the open when they arrive," he countered firmly. "Please, Josephine, I need to know you're as protected as possible." Reluctantly, she moved behind the largest boulder, though she kept the revolver ready. Wyatt positioned himself where he had a clear view of their approaching pursuers while still having access to cover. When the riders were within shouting distance, Wyatt called out, "That's far enough." The men reined in about 50 yards away. The leader, a burly man with a scarred face and cold eyes, studied Wyatt with calculating interest. "You'd be John Morgan's boy," he called back. "Grown up some since I last saw you." The confirmation that this was indeed Jake Thorpe sent a chill down Wyatt's spine. "What do you want, Thorpe?" "Just what's rightfully mine," the outlaw replied. "Your pa took something valuable from me 10 years back. I aim to retrieve it." Wyatt's hand tightened on the rifle. "My father never stole anything in his life." Thorpe laughed harshly. "No, then what do you call that map he lifted from my saddlebags while I was sleeping? The map that led to the biggest gold strike in West Texas." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The map in the pouch Thomas Mitchell had given him, the one his father had apparently entrusted to his friend for safekeeping. "My father caught you rustling his cattle," Wyatt countered. "Whatever he took from you was evidence of your crimes." "Evidence worth killing for," Thorpe agreed with a chilling smile. "That map leads to a vein worth millions. I spent 2 years finding it. Your pa spent 10 minutes stealing it. Seems fair that his family paid the price." Rage boiled in Wyatt's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. "So you murdered him, and my mother died of grief, and now you're hunting down anyone who might have the map." Thorpe shrugged. "Business is business. Now you hand over that pouch Mitchell gave you, and maybe I'll let you and your lady friend ride away." The casual threat against Josephine was the final straw. Wyatt's decision crystallized in that moment. He would not allow this man to hurt anyone else he loved. "Here's my counteroffer," Wyatt replied coldly. "You turn around and ride away, and I won't put a bullet between your eyes for what you did to my father." Thorpe's expression hardened. "Have it your way, boy," he signaled to his men, who began to spread out, clearly preparing to rush the outcropping from multiple angles. Wyatt fired a warning shot that kicked up dust near the hooves of Thorpe's horse. Next one won't miss, he promised. I've got cover, you're in the open, and I was shooting varmints at this range when I was 12. The standoff stretched for a tense moment. Then unexpectedly, a distant sound broke the silence, hoofbeats, many of them approaching from the east. All heads turned to see a group of riders coming fast from the direction of Telegraph Station, at least a dozen men, led by a figure in a marshal's badge. Thorpe cursed violently. "This ain't over, Morgan," he snarled, wheeling his horse around. "I'll find you again." He and his men spurred their mounts and galloped away, heading southwest. Wyatt maintained his position until the approaching riders were close enough to identify a U.S. Marshal and a posse that included, to his astonishment, Sheriff Turner from Cottonwood Springs. "Morgan," the sheriff called as they drew near. "You two all right?" Lowering his rifle, Wyatt nodded. "We're fine." But that was Thorpe and his gang heading southwest. The marshal, a weathered man with a silver mustache, signaled to half his men. "Johnson, take 6 men and go after them. Don't engage unless you have clear advantage, but don't lose them." As the designated men rode off in pursuit, the marshal approached Wyatt. "Marshal Wade Garrison," he introduced himself. "Got a telegraph from Doc Blackwell yesterday, saying you might be headed this way with information about Jake Thorpe. Seems we arrived just in time." Josephine emerged from behind the rocks, still holding Wyatt's revolver. "How did you know we'd be here specifically?" she asked. Sheriff Turner dismounted with a grin. "Wasn't hard. Thorpe's gang isn't exactly subtle about leaving tracks. We followed them following you." Relief washed over Wyatt, followed by exhaustion as the adrenaline drained from his system. He swayed slightly and Josephine was immediately at his side, supporting him. "He's wounded," she explained to the lawman. "Gunshot to the side 2 days ago, and the wound reopened during our ride." Marshal Garrison frowned with concern. "Can he make it to Telegraph Station?" "I'm right here," Wyatt protested weakly, "and yes, I can ride." But his body betrayed him. As he took a step toward his horse, the world tilted sideways and darkness closed in. The last thing he heard was Josephine calling his name. Wyatt awoke in an unfamiliar bed, sunlight streaming through a nearby window. For a moment, disorientation gripped him, then memory returned in a rush. Thorpe, the standoff. The marshal's timely arrival. "Welcome back," said a familiar voice. Turning his head, Wyatt found Josephine seated beside the bed, a book open in her lap. Her smile was tired but relieved. "How long?" he asked, his throat dry. "Nearly a day," she answered, reaching for a glass of water on the bedside table. "You lost a lot of blood and the wound was inflamed. The doctor here said you were lucky." As she helped him drink, Wyatt noticed they were in a small but comfortable room. "Telegraph Station." Josephine nodded. "The station master's wife runs a small boarding house. Marshal Garrison insisted we stay until you're well enough to travel." She set the glass aside. "Thorpe and his men escaped the posse, but the marshal has issued warnings throughout the territory. They won't be able to move freely anymore." Wyatt's hand went instinctively to his chest, searching for the leather pouch. Seeing the gesture, Josephine reached into a drawer and withdrew it. "It's safe," she assured him. "No one has opened it but me, and only to confirm what Thorpe was after." Wyatt took the pouch, extracting the map it contained. The crude drawing showed terrain he recognized from his childhood, the hills west of their Texas ranch. An X marked a location with the notation "Matter Vein" scrawled beside it. "So this is what my father died for," he said quietly. "A gold map." "A map Thorpe obtained illegally himself," Josephine pointed out. "Your father must have discovered it when he caught Thorpe rustling cattle, realized what it meant, and took it as evidence." Wyatt stared at the yellowed paper, emotions warring within him. "All these years I've been running from the memory of what happened, believing there was nothing left for me but drifting. And all along, my father left behind something that could have changed everything." Josephine took his hand. "It still can," she said gently. "Not the gold itself, but what it represents, a chance to build something new. To stop running." Looking into her eyes, Wyatt saw his future more clearly than he ever had before. "I stopped running the moment I met you," he admitted. "I just didn't know it yet." A week later, Wyatt was strong enough to travel, though still far from fully healed. Marshal Garrison provided an escort back to Cottonwood Springs, where they were welcomed like returning heroes. Dr. and Mrs. Blackwell embraced their daughter with tears of relief. then surprised Wyatt by extending the same welcome to him. "You kept our Josie safe," Martha said simply. "That makes you family." In the days that followed, as Wyatt recovered his strength, decisions were made that would shape the rest of his life. The map went to Marshal Garrison, who promised to investigate its authenticity and ensure that any legitimate claim would be recognized. If the gold vein was real and unclaimed, the proceeds would legally belong to Wyatt as his father's heir. But more important than potential wealth was the certainty that had finally replaced Wyatt's restlessness. When Sheriff Turner formally offered him the position of deputy, Wyatt accepted without hesitation. When Caldwell asked about the cattle drive to Denver, Wyatt recommended another man for the segundo position. And when he was finally well enough to ride without pain, Wyatt took Josephine to the creek where they had shared their first kiss during their flight from Thorpe. "I've been carrying this for 2 weeks," he said, withdrawing a small box from his pocket as they sat beside the water, "waiting until I was sure I could offer you the life you deserve." Josephine's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Wyatt, I love you, Josephine Blackwell," he said, taking her hand. "I've spent most of my life believing that love was a weakness, that attachments only led to pain. You showed me how wrong I was. You gave me a reason to stop running and start building." Tears filled her eyes as he continued. "I can't promise it will always be easy. There's still a wanted outlaw with a grudge against me out there somewhere, but I can promise that I'll never run again from danger or from feelings. I'm here to stay if you'll have me." "If I'll have you," she repeated, laughing through her tears. "Wyatt Morgan, I've been waiting for you to ask since the day you saved Tommy Jenkins." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Wyatt felt the last pieces of his old life fall away. The man who had ridden into Cottonwood Springs believing that the frontier was no place for love, that a solitary existence was the only safe path, had found not just a home but a heart to share it with. 6 months later, they were married in the small church in Cottonwood Springs, with Dr. Blackwell proudly walking his daughter down the aisle and Martha weeping openly in the front pew. Thomas Mitchell came from his ranch to stand as Wyatt's best man, bringing with him a silver-framed photograph of Wyatt's parents that had somehow survived the destruction of the Morgan Ranch. "They would be proud," Thomas said, pressing the frame into Wyatt's hands before the ceremony. "Your father always said you had the heart of a lion. Turns out you have the heart of a husband and family man, too." As Wyatt stood at the altar watching Josephine approach in a gown of ivory satin, he finally understood what his father had known all along, that true strength came not from isolation but from the courage to love deeply, to build connections that withstood frontier hardships, to create a home that offered shelter from life's storms. When the marshal's investigation confirmed the legitimacy of the gold claim, Wyatt and Josephine used part of the proceeds to build a house on the outskirts of town, close enough for her to continue working with her father and eventually fulfill her dream of medical training, yet spacious enough for the family they both hoped to create. The rest they invested in the future of Cottonwood Springs itself, establishing a school fund and helping to finance the railroad connection that would bring new growth to the town they now called home. And if in the quiet moments before dawn, Wyatt sometimes woke with the old restlessness flickering at the edges of his consciousness, he need only turn to find Josephine beside him, a reminder that some journeys end not in continued wandering, but in the discovery of where you truly belong.